Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to explore a university that's doing things a little differently. We're talking about the African Leadership University, or ALU, and we're going to be looking at them through the lens of this article titled, "A University Where Students Define Their Social Mission." Just the title alone got me hooked.
Yeah, it's pretty catchy.
Imagine a university where, like, every student has a personal mission statement. It's not just some, corporate jargon. It's part of their DNA.
It really challenges our traditional notions of what a university is all about, right?
Yeah.
We tend to think of education as this very linear path, get a degree, get a job, climb a ladder. But ALU is saying, hey, there's a whole other way to think about this.
So let's rewind a bit. ALU was founded, about a decade ago now by Fred Swaniker, and he's kind of this, serial entrepreneur with roots in both Africa and Silicon Valley. So from the get-go, you have this blend of entrepreneurial thinking and a deep understanding of Africa's potential.
And Swaniker's initial vision was pretty audacious. I mean, he wanted to create a network of 25 campuses across Africa, all dedicated to developing leaders who could drive transformation on the continent.
25 campuses. Wow, that's a bold goal. But I mean, the challenges facing Africa are massive, so maybe that's what it takes, right? So did they actually hit that target?
Well, as you might imagine, launching one university is a huge undertaking, let alone 25 in various African countries. They ran into a lot of roadblocks, local regulations, the whole accreditation process, securing funding, and even attracting local students. There was a lot of skepticism about this whole unconventional approach.
So instead of 25 campuses across the continent, they ended up with,
They streamlined their model, focusing on two main campuses, one in Mauritius and one in Rwanda. Plus, they created this network of what they call learning hubs spread throughout the continent. Think of them as like smaller, more localized centers for students to connect and collaborate.
Okay, so they had to adapt. But I'm curious about the impact of all this change on the university itself, because constant evolution can be exciting, but it can also be pretty disruptive, right?
Absolutely. And the article really highlights this tension. Imagine trying to create a stable, supportive learning environment when the very foundation of your institution is in constant flux.
I can see how that could lead to burnout both for students and staff.
Mhm.
How did ALU address that?
Well, they had to be really strategic, not just about managing burnout, but also about attracting the right people. They needed individuals who were not just comfortable with change, but thrived in it. People who saw this evolution not as a burden, but as a chance to learn and grow.
That's an interesting point. It sounds like they cultivated a culture that embraces uncertainty and adaptability, which, when you think about it, are pretty essential skills for anyone who wants to make a real impact in the world.
Right. And that leads us to the heart of ALU's philosophy, the personal mission statement. This isn't just some add-on to the curriculum. It's baked into every aspect of the student experience.
Okay, so paint me a picture. Here's a new student, first day at ALU. What happens? Do they just walk in and say, "Here's my mission statement. World, get ready"?
Well, it's a bit more structured than that. They have a whole system in place to help students define and refine their missions. There are foundational courses, kind of like your core classes, and then these micro courses,
Yeah.
which are like bite-sized learning experiences on specific skills.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they have faculty and learning coaches who provide individual guidance.
Okay, so there's definitely structure, but how do they connect these personal missions to the larger issues facing Africa? I mean, we're talking about some pretty complex challenges.
Right, and that's where the 7 grand challenges and 7 grand opportunities come in. They've identified these key areas like urbanization, healthcare education, natural resources, things that are crucial to Africa's future.
So instead of just picking any random cause, students are encouraged to align their missions with these broader themes. That's smart. It gives them a framework to think about how their passions can contribute to something bigger.
Exactly. And to further support that, they have a huge emphasis on entrepreneurial thinking. It's not just about theory, it's about giving students the practical tools to turn their ideas into action.
Okay, so we've got personal missions, grand challenges, entrepreneurial spirit. It's starting to sound like ALU is less of a traditional university and more of a launch pad for social change.
I think that's a pretty accurate description.
Mm-hmm.
And the article highlights a few examples of student missions that really illustrate this.
Oh, I'd love to hear some examples.
So there's Sifo Chakawa, who's passionate about using software solutions to support decentralized government. Then there's Francesca Ikandaho, who's developing an AI-powered voting system. And Mornfolua Agdadura, who's focused on urban sustainability in Lagos. These are just a few examples, but you can see how they're tackling real-world issues with some really innovative approaches.
It's amazing to see young people already making such an impact. But I have to wonder, how does ALU ensure that these missions aren't just idealistic pipe dreams? How do they instill a sense of accountability?
That's where things get even more interesting. Their approach to accountability is directly tied to their emphasis on hands-on learning. But we should probably unpack that a little later. First, I think it's worth looking at how ALU itself is working towards sustainability. They can't exactly change the world if they can't keep the lights on, right?
Very true. So how are they managing that? I know they relied heavily on philanthropy in the early days. Is that still the case?
They're definitely working on becoming more self-sufficient.
Tell me more about that.
So they're gradually transitioning from relying mainly on donations to generating revenue through tuition fees. They're also exploring new avenues like continuing education programs, which could provide another income stream.
That's interesting. It sounds like they're trying to build a more diverse and stable funding base, which makes a lot of sense. But I imagine there are still challenges, especially if they want to keep ALU accessible to students from all socioeconomic backgrounds.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act between financial viability and inclusivity. And it's a challenge they're very aware of.
This all begs the question, can this model actually work in the long run?
Well, the author makes this really fascinating comparison between ALU and those ancient universities like the University of Timbuktu. It's an interesting analogy, but I think it deserves its own time to breathe. So maybe we should delve into that after a quick break.
I agree. We've covered a lot already. The origins, the challenges, the student missions. ALU is definitely doing things differently. But what does it all mean for the future of education? Can this model be replicated elsewhere? And what can we learn from their approach, even those of us outside of academia? So many questions. We'll be back in a bit to explore them.
All right, so before we went to break, you were about to tell me about this comparison between ALU and the University of Timbuktu.
Yeah, it's a pretty intriguing parallel. The author argues that back in its heyday, Timbuktu was like the place to be if you were a scholar. I mean, it drew people from all over the world, and they were really pushing the boundaries of knowledge, kind of like what ALU is trying to do now. So are they saying that ALU could be like a modern-day Timbuktu, like a hub for intellectual and cultural exchange, but for, a new generation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're suggesting that ALU could be a model for the future of education, just like Timbuktu was in its time.
That's a pretty bold statement, though ALU's only been around for about a decade, right?
Right, they're still a young institution,
Huh.
but there's this palpable sense of belief and commitment from the founder to the students, even the author of this article. It's like they all know that ALU isn't just another university, it's something bigger.
Yeah, you can feel that energy. It's contagious.
Definitely. But it's not all perfect. The article also mentions some internal tensions within ALU, like the fact that there are a lot of professionals with backgrounds in American higher education, which could create a bit of a cultural disconnect. It's a reminder that even the most innovative institutions aren't immune to these kinds of dynamics.
So they've got their work cut out for them. But even with the challenges, the author seems convinced that ALU is too important to fail.
Yep. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. We're watching this grand experiment unfold in real time, and the stakes are high. If ALU succeeds, it could change the way we think about education, not just in Africa, but globally.
Okay, so let's circle back to that whole idea of accountability through mission that we touched on earlier. You were saying that it's tied to ALU's emphasis on hands-on learning. How does that work?
Well, think about it. ALU doesn't just want students to write research papers about solving global problems. They want them to get out there and actually try to make a difference.
Right. They're all about putting those ideas into action.
Exactly. Students participate in all kinds of hands-on experiences, group projects, field study shadowing. They're constantly interacting with entrepreneurs, industry leaders, people who are already making an impact in their communities.
So they're learning by doing and by seeing how things work in the real world.
And that's where the accountability comes in. When you're working directly with communities and facing real-world challenges, you can't just hide behind theories or abstract ideas. You have to take ownership of your actions and their impact.
That's such an important point. It's one thing to talk about wanting to change the world, but it's another thing entirely to actually do the work and face those inevitable setbacks.
Absolutely. And that's why ALU's focus on entrepreneurship is so crucial. They're trying to cultivate changemakers who are comfortable taking risks, experimenting and learning from their failures.
It's like they're saying, here's your mission, here are some tools, now go out there and make it happen.
And they do provide a lot of support. Remember that whole ecosystem we discussed?
Yeah.
The courses, the coaches, the workshops?
Right. It's a very holistic approach.
Yeah.
But how do they actually measure the long-term impact of all of this? Are students actually sticking with their missions after they graduate?
That's the million-dollar question. And the article does offer some promising data. ALU tracks their alumni careers, and they found that 80% of their graduates are continuing to pursue their missions in some way.
80%, that's pretty impressive. And I guess it's
Yeah.
hard to know for sure if that's entirely accurate. Maybe the alumni who are most engaged with ALU are also the ones most likely to share their successes.
That's a fair point. There could be some bias. But even if that number is a bit inflated, it still suggests that ALU is having a real impact. They're giving their students the skills, the mindset, the connections to make a difference.
It's exciting to think about the ripple effects that this kind of education could have. If ALU can prove that their model works, it could inspire other institutions to completely rethink their approach.
And that's precisely why the author believes that ALU is too important to fail.
It all sounds great, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that this model is operating within a very specific context. Can it really be replicated in other parts of the world?
That's a really good question.
What aspects of ALU's approach do you think would be the toughest to replicate elsewhere? And what do you think is more universally applicable?
Those are some great questions to consider.
Okay, so we were just talking about the challenges of replicating the ALU model in other settings.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, ALU has some definite advantages. Um, they're in a part of the world where people are really hungry for change. I mean, they recognize that the old ways of doing things haven't really worked.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's this real sense of urgency, this need for fresh solutions to tackle Africa's complex problems.
Exactly. And ALU's tapped into that energy. They've built a community of students and faculty who are all in on this mission-driven approach.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
But wouldn't you say that same drive exists in other parts of the world too? I mean, look at the movements for social justice, climate action. People everywhere want to make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes ALU so potentially transformative. It's not just about building a different kind of university.
Yeah.
It's about showing that this mission-driven approach can work anywhere.
Okay, so how do we translate these lessons from ALU into other contexts? What are the key takeaways?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the power of asking the right questions. Instead of asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what career should you choose? ALU is asking, what kind of impact do you want to make on the world? That shift in perspective can be huge.
Yeah, it's like reframing how we define success.
Yeah.
It's not just about personal achievements or material wealth anymore. It's about the positive change we create.
Right, and it's not just about individual impact. Either ALU stresses collaboration and teamwork, recognizing that big problems need diverse perspectives and people willing to learn from each other.
That reminds me of what we talked about earlier, the importance of hands-on learning ALUs, not just about theory. It's about getting students out there working with real communities, experimenting and learning from their mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. It's one thing to talk about making a difference.
Yeah.
It's a whole other thing to roll up your sleeves and do the work.
It's about taking action, not just having good intentions.
Exactly. And that's where the entrepreneurial spirit comes in. ALU encourages students to be bold, take risks, and see failure as a learning opportunity.
So it's not enough to just have a mission. You also need the guts and the resilience to see it through even when things get tough.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all learn from regardless of our background or what we do.
It's a good reminder that we all have the potential to be change makers. We all have something to offer.
And the more we can learn from places like ALU, the better equipped we'll be to create a more just and sustainable world for everyone.
Well said. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into ALU. They're definitely shaking things up in the world of education, and their story offers so many valuable lessons for all of us. So as we wrap up, here's a question for you to think about. What change do you want to see in the world? What steps can you take, even small ones, to start making that happen? Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make a positive impact.